Three. Are we having a countdown?
I think she
Oh.
said that.
Go. Okay. So a heartfelt thank you to you both and those that are joining us from their warm homes today. And thank you for sharing space with me. And I hope you're all in Chardikala. I just wanted to recognize that we have possibly some people tuning in on the YouTube because this is live. So I just wanted to say welcome to them as well. And before we begin, I wanted to let everybody know that today I'm dialing in from the traditional territory of many nations, including the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, as well as the Wendat peoples, acknowledging our presence as settlers on their sacred lands and extending Sikh solidarities with nations on Turtle Island. With that, I want to welcome you all here today. This is the first installment of 3 feminist dialogues that will take place on Sikh Past, Sikh Present, and Sikh Future. And I'm beyond thrilled to start this off by talking about Sikh Past with you two, Angela Aujla and Harjot Gomin Mataru, both artists that are exhibiting within chashm-e-bulbul, and both artists that I've had a very long-standing relationship with. And through this exhibition and the curatorial process, I've really learned a lot about you as individuals, but also your expertise and where you come from. So welcome and thank you for being here.
Thanks for having us.
Oh, of course, of course. I wanted to just start this conversation because I don't think people have seen, not everybody has seen it. And I know one of our advocates and somebody who's been supporting us has been Ruby, the artist, Ruby. And I just wanted to maybe start by talking a little bit about the exhibition. And if you can, maybe Angela, if you can start off by what your experience was like from our first conversation and what the final exhibition of your planned works ended up looking like for you, if you don't mind.
Sure. Yeah. Well, the call that I got from you, Raji, last year was during sort of the height of the COVID restrictions, and while they had been wearing me down for some time, as I'm sure was the case for most people. So Raji's call came at the most opportune time where I needed something. I needed something to look forward to. And her idea of bringing together these stories that were from women in the diaspora and focusing on those marginalized voices melded so well with the work I was already doing and the work that I wanted to do, but didn't have a space for. So one of the ideas that I had for a long time was called My Grandmother's Dress. And it was based on a dress we had in the family from my grandmother, my nanny, but we called her grandma because we were, it was a very assimilated type of time, and that those were the words you use. My own children use the word nanny rather than grandma. So you see that as one of those diasporic stories or ways of being and ways of practicing culture too. So I purposely kept it as grandmother, even though that's a Western term, because that was how we grew up. So within this, I wanted it to be a dress because first of all, fashion is fun. And then also because it was to show in that time where she came over, which was the 1950s, the women adapted to Western culture. And so they didn't think twice about changing over to Western clothing. So in the family photographs and archival photos of that time period in BC, you do see them in the 1950s dresses and shoes and beautiful little purses. And often they still kept the chunni around their neck, but sometimes it was modified as like a Western style shawl or scarf. So I wanted to show sort of the adaptation, but within that, in the dress, I wanted to embed a history. So a history of what was left behind, which was often family members, close family members. My own grandmother left her child behind, my mother, and then also what was created anew, what was created in that diasporic sort of crucible among the different and often conflicting cultures and adaptations. So I I have a number of photographs pinned to the front of it, as well as correspondence back home, back and forth, that correspondence that kept that tie, as tenuous as it was, between home, new home, and then original homeland. So these were some of the things I really wanted to capture, and I left it sort of loose and unfinished. So the dress is frayed, unfinished, unhemmed. You can see sewing needles, dress pins, just to sort of symbolize the unfinished nature of stitching together and unmaking and remaking culture in a new place.
Right. And with Kalapani, I remember in that conversation we had, the initial one, you kind of spoke about what that meant and what you felt hearing these stories. And I always focus on the oral traditions because we don't have literature immediately available to us. So what was your grandmother's stories to you of that migration? And how did you feel as a result of hearing these, I guess we usually say sacrifices, but I'd like to say these newer opportunities of us, going to different places and spaces.
Yeah, and I mean, and it is difficult to know what to call them, sacrifices or opportunities or adventure, like what do you call it? Because for focusing on the women, for many of the women who came over in those early times, like my great grandmother who came, I believe it was in the 30s, she came here because her husband, my great grandfather, had work here in the lumber industry in BC, and that opportunity that he had. And so she, as his wife, it was her duty to come along eventually when those immigration laws opened up. So it's interesting because we don't often think about what was going through those women's heads when they were coming here. They weren't coming here to work. They weren't coming here to friends and family and community because there were so few women here at the time. So they came with no English usually. So it's unfortunate we don't have more of a historical record of that. But what I do remember is my great grandmother sitting in her house in Victoria, even though my Punjabi is limited. What I remember were those words where she was talking about this in Punjabi and the idea of the black water, and if you just seeing it as this impenetrable sea that was full of just things that were ominous to her. As we know, in the Punjab, you don't have the ocean there, and it's not really a culture that's using lakes in some significant way, like going to cottage country here, right? So the idea of water was dangerous, and that danger, you could hear it and feel it in her voice, because she wasn't just thinking of the look of the water and her fear of the water, but she was also thinking of the voyage, and that voyage, which there would have been illness, sickness, death, fear of that voyage. And just the unknown, like they would have known things like how the Komagata Maru was sent back, right? They would have known those things. What are they going to? So you could tell from, I don't remember the context of what she was saying, but that's what stood out to me is the sort of dread and just remembering, even though she was an old woman at the time, thinking back to when she was in her 20s, and that still resonated with her. So I wanted to focus in some of my digital images on that voyage and how it was. Sometimes we don't think of the voyage in between. We think of being in the homeland and we think of being in Canada and what happened in each place. But what about that journey? What sort of stories and histories does that hold? And as a psychological process, what does that do to someone traveling? It's not a flight. It's not a quick flight. It's a long multi-day journey. So I wanted to bring up those kind of questions up again for thought and consideration.
That was such a beautiful experience to go through those conversations and then see the final work. I still find when I go through it and have just the pleasure of spending time with all the little nuanced details of your exhibition, specifically, the feeling of terror certainly arises when I look at that, even when I look at the dress, because then what does that dress symbolize? Like, it makes you think about something that you really won't ever be able to experience now. And it is so serendipitous that we're having this conversation about Sikh Past, because your installation, what I wanted to do is almost have a chronological walkthrough of mass migration of Sikh women to Canada, and to have Harjot in this discussion as well. She also is the person who shares walls with you. So you both were, very connected in your respective installations. And my conversations with Harjot have always been there's so many different things that we do together as collaborators. But one of the things that stood out to me the most with Harjot was how she was such a community mobilizer. I've known her as a curator. I've known her as a friend, of course, most importantly, a writer, oral traditional, like singer, folk singer. And I, through that, got to know her mom. So to understand who she is from the framework of knowing about her mom was such a defining moment for me in our friendship, but also me as a person outside of our friendship. And what was interesting was that when her mom migrated to this land called Canada, the cultural context of her arrival was so different than what we all have grown up with. And I think with Harjot, your exhibition and your planned works, I'd be so curious for you to first speak about how that came to be, how your conversations were, but also like how you felt in that process. But then a little bit, if you can chirp in about your mom's undeniable contribution to folk culture here, it helps lay a very important foundation, I think.
Of course. Jamba, when I started speaking with you about what this piece entails and the idea of migration, and quite literally this analogy of birds and women and that migration, it comes up so often in our folk culture and our folk music, and you'll see it so often in even like pictures and art. It's always referring women to and metaphorically tying them to like birds. And so the idea of jamba, which means flock, which means a gathering, I really want to explore that idea of safe space, of what women who were coming here in the 70s and 80s and 90s and settling in a home, because in Punjab it was quite tumultuous and quite politically aggressive at that time because of what was happening with 84 and all that time. Coming to a land here and being able to settle here, what would they have done to create that safe space? So Jamba was that idea of the things that they would gather, the things that they would put together and create that feeling of home, of Punjab being in their living room. In that space they would gather, and outside the door would be Canada, but inside would be Punjab. So Jamba came from that. So using archival furniture and pieces of art and media that we've collected, my mom has collected, and we've held on to for the past 30 years. I wanted to explore the fact that we are living history. I think that's something that we brush past often, that we always look to what's coming up in future, like what's happening in the future, and pausing to reflect that we are our parents and we are living history in our spaces, to be able to show them off in a way that they are worthy of being in an exhibition. That's what I found so beautiful and nostalgic. I really wanted to bring up feelings of nostalgia, of hominess, and the idea that the shared experience of so many people as they visited was like, oh, that was what my family's house looked like, and oh, we had the exact same piece, because a lot of our art was so similar, and that same sobasing rendition of our gurus was hanging in everyone's homes. And I was able to have a tapestry hung up that is from my family for the past 20 something years, that came from other family from Malaysia and came over. So I wanted to tie in the diaspora from all across the world of Sikh families, and how women as homemakers were the ones who really created a sense of spiritual space for themselves in whatever way they could.
Absolutely. I mean, it's interesting because, obviously the Sikh, there was mass migration during that time. And I think a lot of our families did arrive around that time in our own, in Canada at least. But the fact that the Sikh migration went to so many different parts of the world, and yet the homes looked so similar. I mean, I feel we've had conversations from people who weren't native to Canada, like born and raised in Canada, but maybe in a different part of the world, saying that's what our living room looked like. How did that make you feel getting that kind of feedback?
It was so satisfying to see that, because it's something that I have discussed, you know, when you're in rooms, when you're in groups of people, you talk about these shared experiences and you connect with those shared experiences, but to be able to collect those pieces in that specific rug with that very French provincial style of furniture for somehow that we all went to, I just think it was so, and the wood paneled everything, and that same rich colors of wood that we want to have, and that one cabinet that was reserved for Punjab, and you know, those every little, I feel like everyone had that little jadka and a little something that reminded them of home, and the books that we would get from the Gurdwara, that all the kids were like, oh, we had the same like storybooks to teach us about the Guru stories. And I really want to share what that Sikh experience would have been like for all of us, for most of us who were able to have these artifacts for ourselves, and hopefully we're able to keep them. It was really incredible. I am very lucky that my mom does not throw anything away. So I call her an archivalist now, but she's just, we would call her a pack rat before, but you know, I talked about when I was gathering all these pieces for him, I'm like, what made you hold on to, literally, it's a little Guru Gobind Singh Ji picture, and it's from a fabric store in Malton, and it's from 1993 with the calendar on the back. I'm like, what made you hold on to this? And she's like, Guru di photo fellow. Like, that's the first thing. And the second thing was, she's like, I don't know, I'm going to say this in Punjabi because it always feels better, is that ਮੈਨੂੰ ਲੱਗਦਾ ਸੀ ਕਿ ਕਿਸੇ ਨੂੰ like someone would feel that this is important for them. I don't know why. She's like, I felt this is important for some reason. And so she kept these things for such a long time. And I think I'm in a very privileged position to have been my mother's daughter, and to have someone who was actively participating in Punjabi culture in North America, and actively creating culture and cultural spaces for our community. I'm very, very blessed to have been raised in that environment, and I think that that gives me another element of like appreciation for every little thing of cultural product our community creates, including chashm-e-bulbul. Like, I can imagine me speaking to my kids like, this happened and this was important, and that idea of being my mother's daughter and being able to see the things she had to do to maintain her culture and understand that this was going to be important one day, that was central to, if you walk through the exhibit, through every piece that I put into the place.
100%. And it's very felt. I feel Raj Gomananti, you know, for those that might be tuned in and may not know, but, you know, she's an icon. She's a living icon. I got to have the pleasure of getting to know her for the Globe and Mail article. And I remember something that you had said in a spoken word piece about this performance of lament on stage, or something. I don't want to expand on that, but, you know, I couldn't understand. I understood the conflict of our identities as Indo-Canadians, or you know, this kind of duality, and then being women, and really, for me at least, being raised in a very conservative home, like the pressure of honor and reputation being put on our shoulders. And then that lament, for me, that's what it meant. But then when I got to know your mom, I was like, her entire existence has been of some level of a resistance, something that you say a lot, Harjot, because when she came to be, there were only these duets that were being performed by men for very specifically male spaces, or male spaces where men were safe and women certainly were not. You know, can you talk to us a little bit about that history for her?
Absolutely. So pop culture for Punjabi, in the Punjabi scene in the 80s, 90s, early 2000s was, it still is, male dominated. And the kind of music that was being popularized, and still is, you know, heavy on drinking and sexualization of women, and, you know, really glorifies violence. And she's classically trained. She has her master's in music, and her focus is on folk music. And so she always was so separated from what was popular in popular music and what she knew Punjabi folk music to be, and what she knew Punjabi music could be. So she, rather than, standing complaining about it, she's like, okay, well, I want to create the alter of what that is. Well, what is the alternate? So hers was, okay, well, if I don't want to participate in this culture, I will create my own lane, which was creating, a lady Sangeet group, singing folk Punjabi music, songs that have been passed down from our grandmothers and mothers through an oral tradition, and that have been adjusted and have changed through time, and have really been she's taken as her mantle to share this music and to keep it alive in any way she can. So she recognized that she needed to be a voice in that way, and her we were referring to what we say is that, she recognized that her existence was an act of resistance. I also that often is that, we as Punjabi women with agency, with the privilege of having agency, is that our existence is an act of resistance. And what if you have that privilege, then what do you do with that? So I think her being a woman, as she says, a woman with guts, she had to make sure that she could keep moving forward, and understand that she had to then be an example for myself. For her pursuit of her art, she sacrificed extended family, she sacrificed relationships with extended family, but for her that was okay, because that meant that she could continue singing, she could continue her radio work, her art, her plays, her acting, and then also put me into that art as well. So I was very privileged to be able to do that with her, if it wasn't for her to do those things.
Mm-hmm. And Angela, I know for you, like you're obviously your parents aren't immigrants. Like you've certainly been in Canada, your family, for much longer. In your upbringing and in your experience in general, like, did you notice any kind of stratification, like of men being raised either in Punjabi culture or through the Sikh religion, or both, being treated differently than women? Like, was that something, that you felt in your life?
Yeah, I mean, certainly. And it doesn't, it's a complicated one, because I mean, as I mentioned, my great grandparents came, but then also different family members stayed behind or went back. So my parents actually both grew up in India, even though, say, my mother's siblings all were born in Canada. So it's all over the map with our family, and it's very hard to say even what generation I am, because I could say, well, my great grandfather was here in 1906, but then I could say my dad was here in 1972. So, it's a very mixed sort of thing. And that's interesting too, because we're used to thinking of migration as, okay, your whole family was there, now your whole family's here. But I mean, part of that is the restrictive and gendered immigration policies, with women not being allowed into the country until 1929, I believe. So, I mean, certainly there's a mix. The patriarchy, the misogyny, the violence that I've seen against women in our culture so when I say in our culture, but that misogyny, that violence appears in every culture. So I would say it's certainly a problem with its own cultural trappings when we think of it in Punjabi culture, for example. But it is also an interesting topic because in Sikh scriptures themselves, you don't see any support for domination over women. You don't see any support or, words that say that men are better than women. You don't see anything to support that, but yet you see it in culture. You see it in the culture in practice. And I think that was just reinforced when, say, Sikhs or Punjabis came over from the Punjab and settled here. They settled in a patriarchal culture, an existing patriarchal culture, very, very strongly so, because it wasn't even just in law, it was also in religion, like Christianity, which was the dominant religion. So that gender division, what existed in Canada. And so part of assimilation was also fitting into that. And at the same time, it was almost like a double layer of problems for women and for everyone for that matter, because as we know, it's not just the woman's problem if there's patriarchy and misogyny, it's the whole society's problem. So I think it just became more of a mess because you had the cultural patriarchal practices, Punjabi ones, and then you had them mixed in with the ones that existed in Canada. And then what? Trying to sort this all out. And we're still trying to sort this all out. And I think what I see now is like more women speaking out, and women never thought it was okay. Like, so women have always spoken out, but were they heard? So in, say, early generations of just South Asian women in general here pointing out those issues, they didn't really have a place where they could necessarily be heard. But if you look at now, like Raji, you're writing articles, you're on the radio, like we're doing artwork, I'm a professor, we're able to have more influence, and we're able to connect more in more significant ways with like-minded individuals doing this kind of social justice work in our communities. And I mean, amplify those things through social media. So those feelings that had always been there and that impetus for wanting change, it was very hard to make that happen outside of the home even, because where were those channels? Where were those platforms? So
I mean, it's interesting. It is interesting you say that, because that it's been a learning, knowing our role that we've inherited to resist patriarchy, but then also in learning our role as women, broadly speaking, of course, their role perpetuating patriarchy as well. So I think that it's twofold. And I'm glad you brought that up, because a part of a deep question that I've been asking myself over the last, like, honestly, I feel like since I was born, is where did this patriarchy come from when it's not visible in our religion? But it is so prevalent with I understand that in colonial and Western countries that patriarchy is omnipresent, it's ubiquitous as an experience. And we've set up an entire society and economy and political structure for the voices of men to be heard and the voices of women not to be. But putting that aside, and I really am trying to get rooted back into India and just generally speaking South Asian, pre-colonial or kind of prehistoric South Asia, like where did the patriarchy begin and why is it continuing to evolve in a religion, a young religion such as ours that is so progressive and the scriptures are so progressive? That paradoxical lived experience, that effect has been so confusing for me. I don't know, Harjo, has it been equally as confusing to you, even as
absolutely. I think like even living in a home where my parents were both considered to be equal partners, and they resisted against so many of the gendered stereotypes, it still shows itself. And I can go back to like a call-in radio show I hosted once, and we're talking about Lordy, and this is in 2011. So this is when the wave of Lordis for girls, Lordy for her, Kuriyan di Lordy was starting. That conversation was just starting. Now it's like, oh yeah, I would have a Lordy for my daughter. But 10 years ago, this was still a very new and very, very controversial topic, and we were literally hosting a call-in show about it. And it was staggering to me that men calling in were the ones who were like, of course I would celebrate my daughter. My daughter's my angel. And women calling in were the ones who were saying, but this is our tradition. This is why it's always done. We don't even have the music to celebrate with girls. We don't have what will we do for their Lordy? We don't have the practice. And that always felt like, okay, so the patriarchy has existed, but it's not just the society. It's all of us within the system, because we refuse to create an alternate system and adjust our practices and create new practices and make them socially acceptable. In 10 years, a Lordy for a girl is it's so common. It's not a second thought. But 10 years ago, it was definitely a controversial topic. So I think that the conversations like this, holding spaces like this, having exhibitions, and having the amount of voices, as Angela was saying, you know, in the arenas that we're able to have them now, these are steps in creating the systems, but there's so much more to be done, because our voices are still absent in the religious sphere. We're vocal on the cultural sphere. We're creating cultural product, but in the religious sphere, women's voices are still quite silent.
Yeah, I mean, so we were supposed to have another woman join this call, Julie, professor from University of Toronto, and she studied Sikh history, and her and I had a lot of conversations about Sikhi and women and feminism, and it's in Sikhi, and you know, it's undeniable, it's you know, peer reviewed and undeniable that the Sikh gurus and poets did not want the feminine principle to serve just as a figure of speech or like a literary device, but it was intended to pervade whole life of Sikhs and people in general, like that you can see those reference points in the text. And when you look at the effect of that, like the lived experience of Sikhs, specifically from the religious standpoint, you know, you go into the gurdwaras or, you know, different spaces of worship back home, women can't perform kirtan, like, you know, just starting that off with Darshan Dwarka's art piece about how women can't perform kirtan, you know, that was of course a tongue-in-cheek way to bring that issue to the forefront. But I wish Julie was here, because we were able to go back into history in terms of locating when that happened. And I'm not sure if you'd be interested, but I would love to give like a little Coles Notes to what our thoughts were.
Absolutely.
As we kind of walk through this. But and I'm going to begin it from pre-Vedic, ancient India, when the Indus Valley existed, which is, you know, of course, Punjab lands on that area of that civilization as well. There was a lot of fluidity based on the artifacts that were collected and just kind of scholarly analysis. There was a lot of like gender equality during that time. And then while it's in question what happened to the Indus Valley, and there's no one way of understanding, like whether it was the Aryan invasion or, you know, maybe it could have been climate or something that ended up with dissolving that civilization. It was the Aryan invasion that also brought in that kind of patriarchy to begin with, as recorded by some academics. And during that time, the Aryans wanted to preserve their bloodlines, and so they created a social structure, which is known as the Brahminical code now. And so, you know, there was the people that were creating such society, the Brahmins kind of at the top. And then, you know, as you go down, there was the untouchables, which were the aboriginals to that land that were pushed into the wilderness. And so society started to evolve into the modern day India based on segregating human and marking their identity based on this classist system. And, you know, when Hinduism started evolving as a religion, Brahmins were the ones that were getting to write that. They were the ones that were getting to negotiate what that looked like. Therefore, a religion formed that was predicated upon othering an entire group of people, the masses. And that conflict continued. And therefore, the rise of Buddhism thrived, because these masses were like, okay, we're going into Buddhism where everybody's one and we're seen as equals. And then Buddhism also kind of started to expand into the East, while Hinduism continued, you know, growing ever so slowly in India. And then the Arab kind of influence came in through trades and economy. And there were settlements where Hindus, Jains, and all these different religious communities were coexisting in somewhat of harmony. But then the Arab invasion through Timur started becoming violent, and the othering occurred between Hindus and Muslims. Then there was a concerted effort. I'm sorry, it's going to a point, I promise. Then there's a concerted effort that Muslims were like, we need to coexist with one another. So there was this mystic Sufis that started, through their song and dance, feel a little bit more like Hinduism. And then there were the Hindu bhaktis that through kirtan and dance were saying, well, we are all one, which kind of aligned a little bit with the Islamic teachings. So there was this kind of moments between that, which became widespread as in that subcontinent. And then, the Islamic invasions and the Mughals and things that were happening started making that tension exist again. Then Guru Nanak Dev Ji was born. And at that time, the Sufi mystics and the bhaktis, that those still movements were still happening, but they were kind of ironic because while the bhaktis were saying we're all one, they still practiced the caste system. And so he was like, but are we all one then? And for Sufi mystics, he was kind of questioning how much they believed that they were brothers with the Hindus. And so in these questions is what births our religion. And in that act of creation and oneness, even Guru Nanak Dev Ji himself was othered because he looked so peculiar. He would wear a green robe, he would wear a robe similar to a Sufi mystic, the green robes that Sufi mystics would wear, but he would put kesar. He would wear the orange one, which was a little bit more like Hindu bhaktis. His turban would be a little bit more like Sufi mystics, but then he would wear a tilak, which was a little bit more like what you would see in the Hindu visual, like the visual identity. And so he was a peculiar person, but believed in fluidity. And that's where Sikhism began, as I understand it. And so, now we all know like kind of what the milieu was like when we kind of can understand what the milieu was like during that time. So then Julie and I were like, well, what the fuck happened? Like, how did we end up wanting to be one and genuinely believing we're one? But then now there's this androcentric approach to our practice where it's very patriarchal. And then we were able to locate the impact of colonialism on our religion and the need to become a visual identity of oneself. And while Guru Gobind Singh Ji did make the Khalsa Roop, that Khalsa Roop still was pretty fluid. But during colonial times, they decided to mark that as the Sikh identity, that you had to be Amritdhari, you had to look a certain way, pug, the beard, the uncut hair. And the reason why they fixed this identity was because the Akal, like the powers that be were like, if we don't create our own unique characteristics, once the colonizers leave, we're going to become assimilated with Hindus. Therefore, we need to mark ourselves as others. And I think that is the unique, for me at least, the unique part of our dialogue in our history that doesn't come to the forefront enough. What happened to our Sikhi during the 1920s to the 1940s in post-independent India? And why were these negotiations happening? And where the F were the women in those conversations? And I think that's the interesting part for me as a person that's impacted by patriarchy so much, and I think we all are. But for me, I was like, does that mean if I have cut hair, I'm not Sikh? Are you going to judge me now based on just the fact that I'm not a woman, but also that I'm like have cut hair? Like now you're going to qualify my Sikhi, my oneness with you. And I think this categorization and this fixing of identity markers, in my experience, has been othering, and what set the stones for women to become so persecuted in the religion. It's the fixing and the need to fix our identity. I don't know what you think about this, but I feel like when we look at our religion in text and the fact that it's so fluid, but then in our practice it's become so male dominated, I don't know where else to locate female visibility in general, as a general statement. And have you experienced Sikh religion through the feminine divine in places outside of our common spaces of worship? Like, how have you seen Sikh visibility and Sikhi outside of like what we know it in the modern day? Is there an example?
I just want to just a very quick jump in about this, is that, on the on the sort of macro lens on this, in terms of looking at Sikhism in the most, like in the broad sense of the political structure of how the Gurdwara system works, of how, you know, the story, like how the political and the like this almost political party side of it all works. It is extremely male dominated. But in the micro sense, in terms of how I was introduced to my faith, in terms of how faith originates at home, and how Sikh teachings are taught within the family setting, because that's where faith, you know, starts. That was done by women. That was done by dadis and nannis reading stories of the gurus to their children. That idea of what Sikhism could be and what Sikhism is and why I identify with that faith is that because of my nanny, because of the way she spoke to me, because of the trips to the Gurdwara with her sitting beside me, with her teaching me Path. It wasn't male dominated at all. It was completely and utterly female dominated. Even now, my family chooses to do Path at home, led by the women in my family. My mom and my masi are the ones who do Karn Path Sahib, my Sukhmani Sahib Path. My Biji is the one who does our Ardas. And I think that happens at home. So in the micro sense, I think that faith is still heavily spread by women, but it's their agency on the political sense that's where the space for them, they still don't stand up. I remember recently, even in the current South, like in the GTA, you know, the committees here are constantly asking women to join the committees. Like, we need women. They want women on their committees. They're asking women to join, and women don't want to get involved. And it's because of the way that political structures are set. It's the spaces and how men occupy those spaces. Are they safe for women? Do women feel like they can actually raise their voices in those spaces? Will they be heard? Or are they just a token female for the board member to take a picture of? Because I remained a token female for the Punjabi community, for the Punjabi press for a very long time. And I was pulled into the front of pictures, but when my voice came to it, I had to speak up for myself. I was not asked for my opinion. And so, but I was there for the photo ops, you know? So I think that's the same way that women exist in those both spaces. At the political side, women are choosing maybe not to participate in spaces that were not created with them in mind.
You're such an anomaly in terms of your background, because for me it was definitely male dominated, the teachings, and thankfully it was done through Sakya, of course, as all of us probably had, and but it was certainly from masculinist perspective. So my dad was the one who read a Sakya, taught us Path, and then Gyani Avtar Sion from Vernon, BC was the one who like taught us the meaning, I guess, like actually the human interaction and relationship with the religion. But the masculinist discourse was, you know, in our home. So I could be an isolated case. It was built upon othering, even though the religion wasn't. And the othering took place in the form of Sikhs and Muslims, like seeing how we were persecuted by Islam. There was actually a point in my life where I said to my mom, I don't want to go to Abd Muhammad's house ever again. I hate Muslims. And she literally, because of all this sakya I'm feeding, and I was so like, my family was doing kirtan at the Gurdwara, so we were pretty involved in our small community. But saying that, my mom had to really look at me and be like, no. Our religion is to love one another. She said, for how many Muslims have killed Sikhs, there are more Muslims that have saved Sikhs' lives. But you don't hear those stories. And I said, well, why don't we hear them? We go into the Gurdwara, and the Langar Hall is all these photos of Muslims like pulling out our hair. How is that setting a precedent for for your desire for us to want love and have not even tolerance, but love and empathy and compassion for others, like other religions? And so I think that was the dichotomous relationship that I had growing up. Angela, I'm curious about how your experience was, kind of these negotiations and dichotomies that coexist together.
Yeah, well, I mean, certainly religion was around me and I was in it, but we, unlike your families, we weren't as immersed in it. And we weren't directly taught about Sikhi, snippets here and there. And my parents fully believed in everything, but there was no translation. So where was my place? So I go to Gurdwara as a little kid in BC. I sit down. I don't know what's happening. Like, I don't know what's happening. There's visual cues, like the pictures that are hung up, and different Gurdwaras would have different pictures depending on their, their political viewpoints, maybe martyrs, but then the historical ones. And I would stare at the pictures, try to figure them out, try to ask questions, but had very little information. And because I'm older than both of you, I didn't have the internet to help me. Had I had the internet, I was so curious, I would have looked everything up, and I would have had a range of perspectives. There's so much now that's accessible. My questions could have been answered, but I would go to various adults and very few of my questions were answered. And because of my inability to read Punjabi, and though I can understand household Punjabi, I couldn't understand complex Punjabi, like when they're reading, reading the scriptures. So you can imagine, like, my understanding was very limited until I was at an age, like in high school and university, where I was able to go access better texts and read about it and meet more people, like fellow students, who could tell me more. So it's still now, like, by reading authors like Nikki Ganinder Singh, who's
Amazing.
incredible, that I was, you're almost angry because you're like, oh, okay, so all I see is this patriarchal, male dominated, couldn't look at me, even bother to acknowledge me as a female in, but that's not how it is. That's culturally how it's practiced, but in Sikhi, that is not at all how it is. So Nikki Ganinder Singh is a hero, because, and many other women too, who don't have that same platform. Like, the fact that there is so much respect and equality built into the religion at that early time was incredibly radical. And what makes me so angry is people who can understand those words, comprehend those words of the gurus who they are supposed to respect and listen to, and who they claim to listen to, have the hypocrisy to just, oh, that's not, to translate it in their own way. Like, we really need to translate ourselves, to look at who are we getting those translations from? Because for me, from what I could understand, my limited understanding growing up, there was nothing for me. But of course, there could be something for everyone. But the way that it was handed down there was nothing there for me to gravitate to. And no real, like, unless you could understand Punjabi, there was properly, like, fully, thoroughly, and unless you appeared to be devout and you followed, you didn't cut your hair, you didn't have to be amritdhari, but you had to show some visible devotion. Unless you did that, there was no pulling you in. There was no, okay, come and learn from us. It was an exclusion at that time what I felt.
Oh man, I had you saying that just reminded me of this memory. It's very personal, and it's funny that we're having this on a public. I don't even know if people are tuned in, but I'm going to say it anyway. I was dating this amritdhari man, not even dating. We went on a handful of dates, and he was very, very Khalsa. And at one point, he was like, "Oh, because I have the tendency to shave my head, donate my hair to cancer, grow it out. Like I do have, like, a very strange relationship with my hair." And he was like, "Oh, you know what? Like, if we got married, like, I would totally let you have your hair cut short." And I was like, why do you think you need to let me, like, why do you think you
permission?
have to give me permission? Yeah. Like, you're Panthik, man. Like, you read the text. I'm assuming you have your amritdhari, and yet you think you need to give me permission on my physicality? Nah, bro. I think you need to read the book again. And so
the basis of Sikhi is the sovereignty of ourself.
Exactly. It's so, and that's the word. It's the hypocrisy. And I want to say that, and the reason why I wanted to do this entire exhibition and these conversations was because I'm like, I'm not trying to criticize anybody. I'm not trying to say, let's take down male domination, or, let's reverse colonialism. Like, it's truly, let's have an imagination, like, let's have these open conversations and reimagine what it could have been like, because we don't really know what Guru Nanak Dev Ji went through, like on a human level, but we can make assessments based on like traveling so long on these massive journeys and how that must have felt as a human being. And we could take from that and say, it's all there. It's in this book, but it's also in these understandings we could have of the gurus. Are we doing that? Are we, like, we should implicate ourselves. Like, how are we doing as a society, as a people? Where could there be some improvements? Where have we maybe done some harm? Can we collectively look at that harm and say, well, let's heal together? Like, it all begins with a conversation and the desire to listen. And I feel like that's what I was hoping to do through these dialogues. And I saw that Akanksha posted that there are some people listening. So if anybody has any questions, please ask away. I don't know when we will have these spaces again. Hopefully we'll continue to, but I'm just kind of like, well, since we have chashm-e-bulbul as a part of City of Toronto, let's just intervene and have the kind of imagination we want to as a people. I want to ask you both a question based on something that you said earlier, one of you said earlier, which is that we are living history. I think Harjot, said that. I think similarly. I'm like, we're the ancestors of a future generation we don't know. We're living ancestors. And that idea fascinates me. When you're an artist, this idea, it hits differently because your artwork, in effect, lives beyond you. And so when you're producing your work, knowing that in the context of now, it is contemporary, but in the future, it's going to be a momentous piece that can be referenced to future generations that we don't know. Do you think about that when you're creating artwork and the responsibility of an artist and your point of views? And when you think about that, if you do you feel like the spirit of who you are and these thoughts, do you think your artwork communicates that? And those transmissions will occur even in the future? Open question.
I can go first unless you want to. I can't say I think about that. Like, I don't think about who. I sometimes think about who will see it, but not terribly. So maybe if there's like in the case of this exhibit, I did, because there's a set exhibit and an audience that I will know pretty much the demographic of. But I feel like that's not, I think that would interfere with the final product. I think it would be very contrived if I did that. And I feel if I just create something with like authentically, if I don't let those ideas interfere of what will so-and-so think, what will my community or family or whoever, I try not to let that interfere. If I do let that interfere, it turns out horribly. If I come to it from an authentic place that isn't particularly thought out, but just more organic, then that's usually the artwork that I find resonates the most with other people. And I don't need them to get the same message out of it than that I put into it. There's been many cases where I've produced something and the audience has brought to it, because they're bringing to it their own subjectivities. They've brought to it they've taken it somewhere else, right? They've built on it. They've scaffolded their own ideas. And that's what's so exciting to me. If they're just, admiring it, fine. That sometimes makes me slightly uncomfortable because, they love it, but it's just, I don't know what to do with that. But when I see that they are saying things to me like, I'm going to write about this in my master's dissertation, and this makes me think of this, or I was thinking of your artwork when I had this conversation. That's incredible to me. Like, I feel very humbled by it and very honored by it. That's where that's what sort of I do it, or I do the artwork almost like a it's like therapeutic for me. I feel like it's expressing my identity. I'm getting that down in a different form of communication. I've written academic articles, and it's not the same that to communicate in this visual form where I don't have to just be very, very evidence-based, black and white. My own emotion can come into it as well as the academic side. And I think that's more authentic. No one is just one thing, and this is more well-rounded. So I do feel a responsibility, though, to tell stories for women whose stories have been erased and marginalized. It's like that Amrita Pritham poem line where there are many stories not written on paper, but on the minds and bodies of women. And that's where, when I first saw that line, there was nothing else that has resonated with me more when it comes to cultural production.
Yeah, no, that's one of my favorite passages as well. Yeah.
Absolutely. I think for Chamba, this is my first time creating a piece. I have always created spaces for artists to exhibit themselves, or have created spaces for our community to engage in, or created spaces for singers and poets to be able to share their space in. And so for myself, coming in it from this angle as an artist was extremely novel and really beautiful, because I was able to showcase these pieces of art, of not just my experience, but of others as well. So throughout the piece, there's poetry from women who used to, from the diaspora, who would submit their articles to these feminist magazines, and these were self-printed. And the idea of self-produced work was just so in the front of my mind, because that's how our community existed and still exists for so long. It is what we call jugaad. Do it as you need to do it. Get it done. By any means possible, make it happen. And I think that's the way
I'm gonna stop you and say, even in your art making for the first time, you were leveling up women, other artists, other makers before you. You do that as a curator, and then I'm hearing that you did this as an artist as well.
But that's how I have engaged with our community for so long. It's not, that one of the core tenets of Sikhism is sangat. It's I am nobody without my community. We mirror each other. We mirror each other back. Who is coming to see this exhibit? They are mirrored there as well. So when they come into this jamba, they're not just sitting in my living room. They're sitting in their living room. It's not my bijis, the voice they hear, doing ardas. It's everyone's. It's their nani too. It's not just my mom who's on the TV show. It's their auntie that they watched growing up. So I understand that there's the sangat and is the core part of who we are, and that's who I hope continually participates in whatever I continue to do, because for me there's no point of doing it unless there's community involvement within it, because there's a community activation in it. That is so central to everything I hope to do in the future, and how I continue to want to work is through sangat.
It's such an honor, to have had both of you, and your intelligence and your human, your heart as a part of chashm-e-bulbul, just in what you both just answered ever so eloquently. I just was like, how was I so lucky to have been a part of this? It's just endless gratitude. I see that there's a comment from Jasdeep Singh that says our historical texts have been removed from common knowledge. After Guru Gobind Singh Ji left, the leader of Khalsa Panth was Mata Sundari, a woman. No one talks about that. I find a lot of influence in Mata Sundari, and I just thank you for your comment. I actually really wanted to have this. It's a contemporary art exhibition, but I really wanted to talk about the things that are unseen, and the feelings that are unexperienced by others, and ultimately the stories that we don't hear. So it was an active intention to bring forward those that have been erased. So I do have an idea of an art exhibition in the future that does look at Sikh women from a historical lens, but it wasn't the intention for this particular exhibition. I see that you have Maharani Jind Kaur behind you. Is that right?
Oh no, actually this one isn't, although I do have,
Okay.
you've probably seen my other artwork by her. I have, I made myself a bag with her, so she would be my inspiration always to take around. But
so I guess I'll close this conversation, if there aren't any other questions from people, by asking you both, just on the spot, and if you don't have an answer, all good, but is there a historical person, female identifying or not, that has been kind of a huge influence on your respective lives? And if so, who is that and why?
I mean, I can't say I've had someone my whole life but in recent years, because I came to being an artist only since 2015. And so you can see in my artwork that I have a lot of those strong Sikh women figures like Maharani Jind Kaur, and to read as much as I could about their past and their lives and just their persistence, like tragic story with Maharani Jind Kaur and having her son kidnapped from her. Absolutely tragic, but like to read about her persistence and how unrelenting she was against colonialism in the Punjab and how unrelenting to get her son back and to read her letters. That's incredible inspiration, as well as figures like Mai Bago, who was just like trying to get it done and trying to do like to rally other people too in her community who she felt were falling short and not, just not being there for important, key things. And so the result, like those women who you see that resolve and you see it in the face of people who aren't necessarily respecting them or giving them, are not listening, but still they just, kept going. So I admire that
Tenacity.
Tenacity is a great word for it, for sure.
Yeah, thank you.
I think I'm going to talk more for myself. It's more the women figures I think I've seen in the community, like on an everyday level. For me, I learned my faith from my nanny and my mom, and I think when I think about going to Dixie Gurdwara and the librarian there, my Punjabi school teachers who somehow try to bring faith into our teachings. I think these women for me on an everyday level showed me things that were so integral to my faith and showing it on the most human level possible. I think for myself it would be those figures.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I feel for me it would definitely be, even everybody that was a part of this exhibition, I feel it was such a moment in my personal life where I was like, I don't think I've ever produced any work that is as important and as meaningful as this exhibition in my personal life. And I, from you both, from Kirat, Jagdeep, Raina, who is really at the base of all of this for me, because original curatorial proposal I had kind of written with his art in mind. I felt like there was there's too many contemporary references for me. So I'll say all of y'all, but in identifying like the peculiarity of our religion, even at the beginning, I do nod to Bibi Nanaki, because it is always hard to be the first of doing anything, and nobody will really understand like why you're working endless hours, why you're traveling by foot to countless locations to spread a message of oneness. But to have somebody see that, recognize it, and give you agency and support and love, that would take another type of a weirdo, imaginative, gumption, gusto, all of that. It would have taken a lot for Bibi Nanaki to support, you know. So I feel like sisterhood is so important, and I like seeing that. And so there's one question that I'm just going to bring here. I haven't read it yet, but it's from Ruby, who I had spoken about earlier. I'm really happy to see you three take up physical space within the context of Sikh Pasts and contemporary Sikh art. Thank you. When space like this and the exhibition exists, I often wonder when or if this will happen next because of the rarity of such significant events. Do you wonder about this as well? I know, Harjot, you and I have spoken about this.
Yeah, I think I don't take it ever very lightly. I think every time I go into the space or I think about this exhibition, I think this is monumental. I understand how monumental it is. And when will this ever happen again? Like it really, I could, because we are friends, because I know the background of how long it took you to get this proposal forward and make it happen on the behind the scenes of having someone like the City of Toronto, and it being something that's funded by the city. Like, those are not easy things to make happen. And I think this caliber of show, they are rare, and it's sad that they're rare. So when we're there, I want to make sure that people come out to see it, experience it while we have it, and then engage with these conversations, with the programming that's coming up, because it is so rare.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, unfortunately, I tend to agree. I feel like even in the phases of conceptualizing this show, like I really did try to, from a curatorial standpoint, look at it through a very Sikh lens of Sangat, and of this may not ever happen again. Maybe the City of Toronto will say, oh, we had a Sikh art show. Okay, so let's give it to another market.
Build our colored quota.
Yeah, so I look at that and I said, well, this show can't just be Jagdeep. Also, like, it was like in conversation with so many people, you know, even it was, we need to bring up Sikh artists, and I and then dare to say like Sikh female artists or Sikh male that identify with giving space to women and use their power actively to make spaces available for women. So it was so intentional because we were like, it may not happen again. So I want to bring in, you know, as many artists as I can without it becoming too, as if we're trying to do too much. So it was a very fine balance. And throughout the process itself, I kept learning of like Noni Kaur. Like, why did I know Noni Kaur? Her art is so good. Like, I wish I could have had that. But then I realized I want to take on that work. So I'm writing multiple curatorial proposals for huge institutions. And I know that I want to only curate Sikh art because I think of the reason, what you just identified, the rarity. I don't know how often it'll happen again. But one thing I would say is that we're going to have some kick-ass programming that's going to bring the spirit into this already spirited show. So for those listening, we do have, you know, these 3 virtual roundtables. On November 6th, we're doing a ladies Sangeet Darbar. And, you know, we have Harpreet Neelam doing her PhD in Sikh studies as well. That's going to do an a cappella kirtan, and 8-year-old, you know, one of our daughters who's going to do an ardas for the future daughters. And then Harjot and her mom, Raj Gominanti, and their collective are going to run a Sangeet that is public participatory. And so people will print it out so people can sing and dance, even if they don't know what we're saying or can understand the words. I feel like the spirit will make you feel like it's you. And then yesterday, I don't know, it was the Cosmos, but I was chatting with Harjot about the copy for this, and she read a piece that she wrote ever so beautifully. And I said, well, girl, we need a day jam. Like, I've been wanting to do a day jam. And then Harjot, obviously music is such a big part of her life, was like, fuck, we need this. We need to do it. I'm so busy, but I'm going to help you make this happen. And then in the passage she wrote, she had Sikh knowledge in there. for music by Sikh knowledge or something. And I was like, yo, I'm going to dial Sikh in right now. And Sikh was like, yo, let's do a Sufi night. And so it is, while the exhibition ends on December 31st, we are going to milk the F out of it and bring in as many people as possible. And so I guess my answer to that question is I wonder and think about it and feel all sorts of ways about this very question all the time. But I see inspiration in our daughters. Like I have a niece and any daughters, and I'm like, oh, no, this is not going to be a one-off. I'm doing it again and again and again. So it has lit a bit of a fire for me. And I think it has for a lot of different artists as well. And Angela, I wonder if you feel this way, because you're like, I think Harjot, you're somebody who was a first-time artist exhibiting, but Angela, you've been doing this for some time and you did this work at McLaren. I'm curious, like, how do you feel as an established artist?
Well, I feel like this was many things I loved about this opportunity, but one thing that really felt freeing and allowed me to just express my artwork in a unsort of censored way was the fact that it was you guys, like the fact that I knew who these artists were that I'm exhibiting with, and I knew what your intent was with this curation, Raji, and that I could just communicate through my artwork without having to translate to like a predominantly white audience, or wonder, oh, well, how will view my artwork through a white lens, so to speak. Like I didn't have to worry about the translation. Oh, they won't understand this, they won't get it. And that's something which I want to take going forward. Like when I exhibit elsewhere, I want to do the same thing, and I shouldn't not do the same. There's nothing that should stop me from doing the same thing, because this feeling of freedom made my work more authentic, and it made it richer, and it made me add things in there that I wouldn't have otherwise. So I think that taking it forward to whatever I do next, I'd like to do that instead of this thing that I think I had been doing, maybe unknowingly, which is to think about the audience too much. Oh, if I submit this to a show, like it would be artwork I'd be perfectly happy with, but I would say, well, I'm not going to submit this piece because look at the audience, where I think that is an insult to my audience as well. I think that audiences are ready for something like this, ready for artwork that is not something they're necessarily comfortable with. And with any art coming from any cultural perspective, you don't always understand it anyways. So it's perfectly fine. So I think that sort of that second guessing, or that thing in the back of my head, I'd like that to be fully gone and erased.
Well, now you have a sangat that you can speak to and say, right. Hey, because that was so fundamental in everything. It was all these long conversations such as these. And I think just relationships, how we're not alone, even though it may feel like it, as a rarity, as this one-off event. Like, I think this exhibition for me, and I hope for everyone who walk through the doors, can see that there is a sangat that is probing these questions, that are asking questions of identity, of what it means to be, Sikh. What does it mean to be feminine? Or, what does it mean to be the daughter of migration? Like, all of these questions, I think, is just allowing us to realize that we all might be feeling similar ways, and that we truly are one with one another. So hopefully that carries forward. And I will offer myself up to any artist that says, hey, I have this quandary, can you please answer? I'll be like, yes, let's get on a call right now. And sorry. But not that word. I should say there are Western ways of doing things that are cool, great. But this, for us, the South Asian way of doing things, like, it's different. The language hits differently. And, there's a way of doing things there too that is as important. And so, having that dialogue, I think it just comes down to the support and that we all want to do it. And so let's just continue to play and have fun with one another. Thank you all. Thank you both so much for your time, just not just today, but everything you both brought to this exhibition. Like, there are no words that I have except maybe in Punjabi, like mera man khosh hunda hai. Like, I'm so, like, somewhere deep inside that I don't even know if there's an English word for, is so happy that I got to be with both of you and that you both said yes to my ask. Thank you, thank you, thank you.
And thank you as well for just starting this from nothing and having that resolve to carry everything through. It came together beautifully, and this is the most memorable exhibit that I've participated in.
Thank you.
Creating space and holding space. Thank you for that, Raji. Thank you so much for that.
Thank you all who listened. Thank you, Rupi, who is such a champion. And Jasdeep, thank you for asking your questions and letting us call out Madha Sundari for all that she's done for us to be here today. Thank you all, and I wish you all just a healthy and beautiful rest of the day and weekend.